I'm Emily Chang, and this is the best of Bloomberg Technology, where we bring you all our top interviews from the week in tech. Samsung's attempt to steal the smartphone thunder from Apple, introducing the new Galaxy Note 8 phone ahead of Apple's next big iPhone event. We have details on both devices. Plus, mutual funds take into account Uber's year of drama. Giants like Vanguard and T. Rowe Price are slashing their valuations for the ride-hailing giant. Could new sales stats help restore investor confidence? And as the price of Bitcoin surges, investor interest is only growing stronger. Now the question is, are we in a cryptocurrency bubble? And when could it pop? But first, to our lead. It's a redefining moment for the Samsung Note line as the South Korean company unveils the brand new Note 8. It is the largest Samsung phone yet and could be its most important. After last year's Note 7 exploding battery fiasco, consumers could be hesitant to pick the model back up. However, Samsung feels confident that the problems are fixed and wants to move forward with what it hopes will be its best mobile device yet. Bloomberg Tech's Selena Wang attended the Samsung Unpacked event in New York and has the story.
I'm here in Midtown Manhattan for the grand unveiling of Samsung's Galaxy Note 8. The stakes are very high for this phone to succeed since it's the latest version since the Galaxy Note 7 was recalled after reports of catching on fire and exploding. Now let's go take a look at it.
The Note has always been Samsung's biggest phone, one with a screen so large it's been compared to a tablet. Now that screen is getting even bigger, measuring at 6.3 inches to be exact. The Note 8 has an improved camera with 2 lenses on the back of the device. It also supports faster networking tech for browsing the web and downloading content. But the question remains, can Samsung win big with customers after last summer's Note 7 debacle? Samsung killed off the smartphone after customers reported problems of early models exploding and even the replacement phones catching fire. The whole fiasco cost the South Korean company an estimated $6 billion.
We won't really know if they've gotten over the Note 7 debacle until probably early 2018, and when the phone's been out there long enough and people have tested it.
But that's not the only problem the company faces. This week, the de facto head of Samsung was jailed for 5 years on charges of bribery and embezzlement.
Samsung's executive management isn't inextricably tied to the brand of the company. Other companies, for instance, Apple's Tim Cook is different, right? He represents the company, and I feel very few consumers even know who runs Samsung.
But perhaps the biggest obstacle the company faces is its competition, especially with Apple and other competitors in Asia. Apple plans to roll out its highly anticipated iPhone 8 in the coming weeks.
If you're doing feature by feature comparison and you look at what is rumored to come into the iPhone, Samsung has a very strong lineup.
Samsung regained its top spot in the global smartphone shipments earlier this year, with 23% of the market after losing ground during the Note 7 scandal. So, can Samsung hold on to its top spot in the increasingly crowded smartphone market? Only time can tell, but one thing is for sure. By keeping the same Note branding, Samsung is making clear that the Note 8 fixes any problems of the past.
Bloomberg's Selena Wang reporting there. Meantime, the latest edition of the smartphone that started it all, the 10th anniversary edition of Apple's iPhone, is still shrouded in secrecy. Bloomberg Tech's Mark Gurman has a lot of the secrets, though, on what to expect from Apple's flagship product and gave us some of the details.
For the first time, they're going to have 3 new phones. The big phone is going to be this premium model that has stainless steel, glass in the front and the back. And as we said here many times before, it's essentially going to be the size of the iPhone 7 Plus's screen, but that's the whole phone. There's no bezels around it on the top or bottom. It's just very slim around there. It'll be easier to hold, not be as heavy. And the 3D sensor for unlocking the phone instead of the fingerprint scanner is going to be the quote-unquote crown jewel of this product.
Let's talk about the 3D face scanner. It'll unlock the phone in milliseconds. It can even do it in the dark. Tell me more.
That's right. So there's two lenses on the front. There's the 3D scanning sensor itself, plus an infrared sensor, sort of the technology that you can use on a classic remote control to control your TV. And what the laser does is it creates this light, so it's sort of like in the dark mode. I imagine like being in a place like you're on a SWAT team and you have the helmet where you can see in the dark. So it's kind of like that. So the phone could be on the table. You pick it up, take it out of your pocket. It knows it's you because it has a wide-angle 3D sensor. Just unlocks, like you said, in a few hundred milliseconds.
Now, when it comes to some of the features, Apple is lagging, right? When it comes to the OLED screen, for example. I did sit down with Tim Cook back in June, and he had this today to say about being first. Take a listen.
For us, it's not about being first. It's about being the best and giving the user an experience that delights them every time. And so we don't let that impatience result in shipping something that's just not great.
Talk about the features when it comes to Apple. Which features are Apple first in and which is Apple behind?
And you can apply what Tim Cook said in your amazing interview from June to any of their recent products. In fact, it was the opening line of this story. So the OLED screen, something that's been appearing in Samsung phones because of their vertical integration. They make the screens and the phones themselves for upwards of 5 years. Yeah. Motorola has had them. HTC has had them. The slimmer bezels, the Essential phone that we had on the show the other day has them. Samsung has had it. What's new? The 3D sensor is going to be new and innovative. The App Store, of course, that's something that they, created. You saw the Android Marketplace, Google Play, everything come after that. And don't forget, Apple was the company that popularized the modern smartphone in 2007 at the beginning.
Right, and also when it comes to processor speed, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Apple has been first.
Right, I remember in 2013, I think a couple months before that, I said this iPhone 5S is going to have this 64-bit chip. And there were so many articles at the time saying there's no way they're going to do that. Apple's not that ahead. But, it was correct. They came up with the 64-bit chip with the 5S in 2013. And they're still years ahead of the competition in processors.
Let's also talk about the home button. It'll be a virtual home button. You get more on-screen real estate. What does this mean?
That's right. So to make the phone smaller, they have to chop off things, right? So the first thing that's going is the home button. They're getting rid of it. It's going to be in the screen, sort of like on the Google Pixel, the Essential phone, but it's actually going to have this home button area. So there's going to be like unique controls in there to do other things. There's going to be some new swiping gestures for navigating between apps. So it's basically moving everything into the screen to the point where you don't really need to click buttons around it. There'll still be the power button. It's going to be longer now to have an easier time clicking with your thumb and the volume buttons, but maybe those will go away in the future too.
Now, obviously, the Note is also coming out. How does this stack up to the competition, whether it's Samsung or Essential?
Well, I think the Note 8 is very significant because of the Note 7, actually. I know we laugh about it, but the Note 7 was one of the highest reviewed phones when it first came out. It was one of the most anticipated and successful phones in terms of the product reviews, but then it started exploding, and that changed everything. So if they get the Note 8 right, it doesn't have a glitch like an exploding battery. I think that's going to be a serious challenger to people's eyeballs for the upcoming year of the smartphone launches.
So what do we know about timing? This new iPhone, whatever it's called, has been dogged by production, rumors that they've had some struggles there. What do we know?
Traditionally, when Apple has supply chain issues or a hard time pumping out a lot of the phones, they'll release it anyways, but they'll release more of the models that they have more supply of, obviously. So there's going to be 3 models. Initially, the mix is going to be much higher for the new updates of the 7 and 7 Plus. We'll see the Pro model, the more expensive one, probably trickle out, but it's going to be hard to find for the first couple months of release.
That was Bloomberg's Mark Gurman there. Well, in India, there is a new non-executive chairman at Infosys, the beleaguered software services company. It's Nandan Nilekani. He is backed by a group of Infosys founders that want to take back control. The founders group has clashed with the Infosys board in recent months, and that led to the CEO's departure last week. Coming up, Uber's year of drama is weighing down its valuation in the eyes of mutual funds. Which funds are cutting price estimates for the ride-hailing behemoth? Next. Plus, Mark Cuban flips on Bitcoin after calling the digital currency a bubble. The tech billionaire and outspoken skeptic is now a believer. So, are digital currencies officially becoming a mainstream investment? We will discuss. This is Bloomberg. Since going public in June, Blue Apron has lurched from one setback to another. The latest challenge, the meal delivery startup is losing its human resources chief and starting a hiring freeze. The company also fired part of its recruiting team, totaling 14 people. The shakeup coming just as the company ramps up a new fulfillment center that is supposed to handle half of its production volume. BlackRock, Vanguard Group, and T. Rowe Price have all lowered their valuations of Uber by as much as 15%. For most of this year, the ride-hailing company has faced a persistent drumbeat of bad news, lawsuits, and boardroom battles. This on top of an ongoing CEO search after Travis Kalanick was ousted in June. Uber has held up its $69 billion valuation as assigned to employees, partners, and prospective competitors that it is a transformational, once-in-a-generation company. Any evidence that Uber might be less valuable than it appears may make it harder for the company to recruit or scare off new competitors. The Bloomberg tech reporter who covers all things Uber, Eric Newcomer, joined us to talk about his newest development.
These mutual funds marking down Uber, I think it was 15% Vanguard, 12% T. Rowe, and then BlackRock, it's 1%.
Just shaven off.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, that's it's a useful sign. I mean, especially as this sort of big SoftBank deal gets done and we don't know what the valuation for the secondary shares that are going to get bought. For people selling into that deal and people doing the selling, having these professional assessments of the company's valuation could give them a guidance.
That was my question because you've been reporting about new investor interest. Is that happening at that $69 billion valuation? And is it significant that the valuation would be flat rather than increasing?
There's certainly a strong interest from the company and insiders to see the primary valuation sort of stay at $69 billion.
So but even if it's flat, is that a good thing?
I mean, it's hard to say. I think given the circumstances, a flat valuation is probably the best they're going to get. And then, of course, it's just sort of a paper flat valuation because for the actual SoftBank is going to do it at that round and then in the secondary. So sort of in terms of what they're actually paying, sort of netted out, it's going to be a lower value.
And who's selling these shares? Are these shares coming from other investors? Are they coming from employees, former employees?
That's a big question, especially, is Benchmark doing the selling? Is Travis doing the selling? The range of sort of the secondary sale that we reported was anywhere from $2 billion to $10 billion. So you can sort of get the sense of how uncertain people are about what the appetite for selling is going to be.
Meantime, there are new numbers out from Uber showing fairly positive revenue numbers. Gross bookings up 17%, trips up 150% in the last year, losses falling. What do you make of the numbers?
Yeah, I mean, they're good. It's all about perspective, right? I mean, Uber's losing historic amounts of money. I think if you annualize the 600-something million losses they had this quarter, right? You get to like $2 billion. If you compare that to Amazon in 1999 when they had their worst EBITDA loss, it was like 300 million. So just the scale of the losses, even as they fall pretty significantly, I think it was fell 9% quarter over quarter. They're still humongous compared to sort of any company you would benchmark.
And for most of that quarter, of course, Uber still had a CEO, even though the investigation was ongoing. So it'll be very interesting to see the numbers for the current quarter.
Exactly.
CEO search, Labor Day is approaching. They had said they would have someone in place by then, or at least have voted on it. Jeff Immelt seems to be the only.
He remains the front runner.
Only name out there.
There were reports that Meg Whitman was back in the mix. We have held our tongue there, sort of purposefully. There are other outlets that have said she's definitely not in the mix. So there's a lot of confusion on that. Benchmark sort of denied the idea that they had, put her out there. So it seems like Jeff Immelt is the main candidate, but there have been these secret other candidates that are purportedly, still in the mix, and we'll see.
Do you think Labor Day is a realistic deadline? Will we know by then?
I think everybody is exhausted and would love to see a deadline met, but it requires, groups of investors that don't all get along to get along, and so hard to say whether they're going to be able to meet the deadline or not. But they're all tired and would love to see it met if everybody can get along.
That was Bloomberg's Eric Newcomer. Coming up, after the events of Charlottesville, Virginia, tech firms like Cloudflare, GoDaddy, and Google have all taken a stand against neo-Nazi groups, but the debate in Silicon Valley over how it deals with hate continues. We will discuss next. Plus, from Apple to Facebook to Amazon, tech firms are stepping up their spending on original shows and content. We break down the new media marketplace. This is Bloomberg. Jeff Jones, the former president of Uber, has been named CEO of H&R Block. Jones left Uber in March after only 6 months at the company. He previously served as chief marketing officer at Target. The move is part of a greater digital push at the tax preparer. H&R Block recently touted a collaboration with IBM for free online returns as it competes with online services like TurboTax. Well, since President Trump took office, tech leaders and the White House have butted heads on several fronts, from immigration to climate change, and most recently the policy around hate speech and hate groups after the events in Charlottesville, Virginia. Now Washington has grown even more critical of big tech firms over their size, hiring practices, and news content, and it could have far-reaching effects on key legislation as well as regulation moving forward. We discussed this topic with Ben Brody, who covers lobbying for Bloomberg News, and Michael Wolf, CEO and co-founder of Activate, a tech and strategy consulting firm.
We mentioned some of these cultural issues here, the ban on trans service members in the military, immigration issues, the travel ban to majority Muslim countries. These are places where the administration and the company have clashed in a very public way. And of course, those kinds of clashes, they do have, policy consequences, especially in this administration where loyalty is a big deal. There is not a lot of love lost, I think, between some of those companies and, the White House, especially given the events in Charlottesville more recently. But I think it's important to realize that there is a policy dimension here too. Issues like privacy are on the table. Issues like net neutrality are on the table. And more, Washington is looking to take them on. And either we don't necessarily know where they're going to go, or it sort of seems like tech may be kind of losing in them. And so there are a lot of ways in which these companies are kind of being surrounded right now.
And obviously the Trump administration hasn't had the best of luck in pushing through its policy initiatives. But Michael, the fact that Congress and the White House are considering tax, energy, immigration reform, that is very important to Silicon Valley. And the White House is clearly not on the side of Silicon Valley. How much of a concern is that?
What you have is a divergence of values. You've got Silicon Valley, where there are a number of things that are very important. Net neutrality, some of the things that were just mentioned, skilled immigration, and you've got the gender issues. But more broadly, we've got things that are important to tech companies, and one of them is consumers. And these are companies that have hundreds of millions of users, and they're very afraid of some sort of consumer activism. And so they want to focus on their values. They're willing to bend their values when it's things that are important to their companies. And so two examples are upgrading the government's infrastructure, where there are going to be contracts for each of these companies, and other things like tax reform, because many of them want to repatriate foreign earnings.
So, Ben, Trump had that recent tweet about Amazon where he said Amazon is doing great damage to tax-paying retailers. Towns, cities, states throughout the U.S. are being hurt, many jobs being lost. Are we getting to a point where tech companies could ultimately end up being regulated like utilities, or at least that's the direction that the Trump administration wants to go?
I don't think it's necessarily that we are at that point yet. I think it's definitely where we are at a point where some people here in Washington, both liberals and conservatives, and I think that's what's really interesting, are sort of calling for people to look in on this. This is not, I wouldn't say, the mainstream opinion yet, but I would say that there are people who say, well, hey, look, there is a lot of market share here. There are a lot of companies, big companies like Amazon, gobbling up smaller ones, or even, medium and large ones like Whole Foods, and they're sort of saying, and Democrats are saying this as well, we need to take a look at what's going on here. I think it's important to realize as well that some of these companies are on the chopping block when it comes to these issues.
So, Ben, how have tech companies changed their approach to lobbying? Obviously, we know they spent a lot of money during the Obama administration lobbying various lawmakers. What's happening right now?
Right. Well, they're spending a lot of money, really, is kind of what it comes down to. There was some talk that these companies didn't have any Republican representation. They needed to, bring in conservatives. I think that was a little overstated. Here in D.C., big companies always employ Democrats and Republicans. But Google had, record spend last quarter in its lobbying. It spent about $6 million. A company like Goldman Sachs often doesn't even spend $1 million. And the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which largely represents the business community of the U.S. as a whole, only about double that, not even 12 million. So they are really spending a lot of money because they know that a lot of things are coming their way, either coming or going, and they want to be a part of it.
Michael, we're looking at, potentially three and a half more years in the Trump administration, yes, at least. What are the main issues that you are going to be watching?
From a tech perspective, I'm going to be looking at any potential efforts that are about hampering these companies, because we can't stop the march of technology. Amazon, Apple, Google, Facebook, these are companies that have not just an impact in the United States, but an impact globally. So we should be wary about anything that gets in the way of their growth. And yes, they are also, they tread in politics. Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post. And so there's a lot about the progress from tech companies that can be threatening to not just to people in the administration, but other businesses.
Now, since the events in Charlottesville, Virginia, a few weeks ago, a surprising topic has come to the forefront in Silicon Valley: deep-seated divisions about how far tech companies should go to silence hate groups, specifically Nazis. Where exactly do these companies draw the line? Can and should they act on moral judgment alone? Bloomberg Businessweek's Max Chafkin explored this topic in this week's issue of the magazine and joined us to discuss.
Silicon Valley has had kind of a hard time navigating the era of Donald Trump. And that's partly because even before the election, there was all of this controversy around companies like Facebook and Google as to whether or not they were media companies or technology companies. If you're a technology company, then you don't have to take any responsibility for any of the content that's on your platform. And if you're a media company, obviously you do. And most of these companies want to be technology companies because they're valued higher. You don't have to spend as much on content moderation. And the thing that happened 2 weeks ago was that, suddenly these companies realized, hey, maybe we actually have to take at least some responsibility. And that kind of came to the forefront when Google and GoDaddy and a bunch of other companies took down the Daily Stormer, which is a Nazi publication that had basically been on the internet until then.
Right. Cloudflare was the last of those companies to finally cut off the Daily Stormer, though you can still find it elsewhere online. This is a company that's taken a more laissez-faire, free speech approach to these kinds of things. We had Matthew Prince, the CEO, on the show, and he said he's still uncomfortable with his decision to take down this site, that ultimately he did so because the Daily Stormer was claiming that they had Cloudflare's support, quote unquote, but that, he believes that no person, no company should have the power to do such a thing. Take a listen to what he had to say.
We turn to the experts in terrorism and illegal content, which is law enforcement, legislators, regulators, and we say, here is this content, what would you like us to do? That to me feels like the principle of due process, that they are actually politically enshrined organizations who can make these decisions, as opposed to these decisions being made based on what the political whims of me or Mark Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos.
Prince is sort of arguing that internet companies, Max, should be regulated more like utilities, that this decision should be out of their hands. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know that he's really thought through that one, because if you're regulated as a utility, that creates he's worried about burdens as to having to check out the content on every site. However, if you're regulated as a utility, that creates a whole additional set of burdens. There are price controls and there's a whole bunch of stuff that I think if you really think through it, you don't necessarily want.
Bloomberg Businessweek's Max Chafkin there. Coming up, call it crypto fever. Bitcoin is bigger than ever as the price surges past $4,000. We get an investor perspective on the future of digital currencies. And a reminder, all episodes of Bloomberg Tech are live streaming on Twitter. Check us out at Bloomberg Tech TV, weekdays 5 p.m. in New York, 2 p.m. in San Francisco. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to the best of Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang. Well, outspoken billionaire Mark Cuban apparently thinks there's opportunity in cryptocurrency after all. Cuban, who tweeted in June that Bitcoin was in a bubble, is now investing in a fund called One Confirmation. The fund will invest in blockchain companies. Cuban tells Bloomberg in an email, "I have always looked at blockchain as a foundation platform from which great applications can be built. Hopefully, we can find a few." Bloomberg Caroline Hyde sat down with Ben Braben, the head of Level 39, one of Europe's biggest fintech firms, to get an investor perspective on the crypto craze.
Blockchain has enormous and transformational potential, and much of the interest in that is finding its expression in the valuation of Bitcoin. But I think what we're seeing is a galloping ahead of the interest in the technology manifesting in the price of Bitcoin.
And not only in the price of Bitcoin, but also in Ethereum, Ripple, but it's also tempting a lot of companies to come out and raise funds in this novel new way of ICOs, initial coin offerings. You write a white paper and within minutes you're able to go to the crowd and raise millions. Is this something we're seeing fintechs in Europe adopt as well as we've seen in the United States?
Well, there's certainly huge engagement with ICOs, token sales, and I think, of course, the SEC in the United States has clarified its view on this recently. The Financial Conduct Authority in the UK, I think, is also taking a keen interest and is keen to make sure that it encourages innovation while making sure it protects the markets and the consumers. The real potential, I think, of ICOs is very exciting, but it comes with health risk. It's an extreme sport.
Extreme sport. And so, therefore, do you think that we will start to see the UK regulations come in and say, look, these are going to be asset securities that we want to be regulated, that we want to be registered in the same way that the SEC has?
Well, the FCA has been consulting on this over the last few months, and I think they are really they haven't declared a clear position looking forward just yet, but they are very clearly, of course, prioritising protection of the market and the consumer while seeking to do everything they can to encourage innovation. And that is one of their key strengths as the sort of the superhero, really, of fintech in the UK. The FCA is keen to make sure it supports innovation and helps the UK retain and develop its position as a great place to innovate in cryptocurrency.
And what's interesting about Level 39 is, of course, you're a hub for startups, but you're slap bang in the middle of where Morgan Stanley or JP Morgan or HSBC is based here in London as well. How much are you seeing the banking sector respond to the rise of blockchain technology and companies that are being born out of it?
I think that's a really great question. And of course, the actual application of these technologies into the great financial institutions of the world that you've described and mentioned it's a long and complex process. So you have to look carefully, you have to listen, and you have to look for the people who are building deep relationships. Of course, that's what we seek to support in Level 39. It's not a dramatic activity. It involves really drilling into the detail of how distributed ledger technology can transform the way in which these great institutions operate.
How can it change the way they operate?
Well, I think, of course, if you consider at the heart of DLT, the distribution of trust across networks, the fundamental transformation, and many people compare this to the early stages of the internet. And I think there's a comparison that's useful because much of the interest in Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies right now, of course, looks a little bit like the hype that surrounded the internet in the mid to late 1990s. But in just the same way, the fundamental transformational potential is probably as hard to see in full now as it was in 1995 as people consider the future of the internet.
I think that was an interesting point that Mark Cuban really made out, that from the ashes of some of these bubbles, like with Bitcoin, you will see the ICOs, the digital currency versions of Amazon, Google, Facebook come to be the real game changers. Where will they be based? Will they be in San Francisco? Will they be in London? Will they be in Zug? Because that's certainly Switzerland's trying to claim precedent in terms of the crypto, what do they call themselves? I think Crypto Valley.
Well, there is a huge amount of innovation, and we can look further afield as well. If we look in China, if we look in Russia and Japan, also great innovation in cryptocurrency. So I think we should be ready to be unsurprised about where the real progress arrives. But of course, it's also important to look beyond cryptocurrencies and consider, for example, the implications of smart contracts. There are some very exciting developments which are also built on the same essential foundation.
There's been questions as to whether one digital currency will win out overall. Do you believe that one will, or can we have many?
Well, I think we're probably going to have many. If you look at the governance debates and indeed the technology debates, which have been shaping the recent development, particularly of Bitcoin, but I don't think any major currency is immune to this. Governance is a real challenge, and scaling is a real challenge. So it is unlikely that one standard will emerge. And of course, it's systemically useful to have real diversity of currency, just as it's useful to have diversity in almost every other.
And what's interesting is also government interaction between yourself and Level 39. Are you discussing with government how they should be adopting and looking at cryptocurrency space and indeed the broader remit? You were someone who used to work with the UKTI, getting startups connected with investment. Are you saying, look, ICOs could be the way for companies to finance themselves going forward?
Well, I think the government already does a fantastic job, and the FCA in particular, as the regulator, does a great job of balancing the challenges of maintaining protections for markets and indeed for consumers, while also really being as permissive as is consistent with that. And it's the envy of regulators around the world, and I've certainly seen plenty of evidence in my travels. As far as the as central government is concerned, I think that there is no doubt in any of the minds, certainly that I've been engaging with, that developing the UK's huge advantage as a great place to innovate is at the forefront of that.
Bloomberg's Caroline Hyde with Ben Braben, Level 39. Well, texting and crossing the street could not only be hazardous to your health, but also your wallet. At least in Stamford, Connecticut, which may become the second U.S. city this year to combat the problem with fines. Just last month, Honolulu adopted an ordinance to outlaw smartphone use by pedestrians crossing streets. Stamford's proposed cell phone crosswalk ban would have the police issuing citations of $30 a violation. U.S. pedestrian deaths have been on the rise, but there are no statistics that show whether texting played a role in any of the fatalities. Coming up, is Facebook's copycat strategy paying off? One industry research group cautions that the highly sought-after teen user base could be waning. And the solar eclipse got everyone's attention, even President Trump donned glasses momentarily to take a look outside the White House. We discuss the excitement around the once-in-a-100-year event. This is Bloomberg. This year, Facebook is expected to see a decline among teen users in the U.S. eMarketer predicts 14.5 million people from the ages of 12 to 17 will use Facebook in 2017. That is a 3% drop from the prior year. This is the first time the research company has predicted a fall in Facebook usage for any group. Teens are migrating instead to Snapchat and Instagram, which is owned by Facebook. But will Snap be able to capitalize on this potential weak spot? Bloomberg Tech social media reporter Sarah Fryer joined us to break down the statistics.
We've seen the stock climb today after a long, drawn-out fall since the IPO. And one of the main reasons, of course, that Snap has fallen is because Facebook has been copying its most popular features on its main app and on Instagram. And this company continues to be very compelling to a lot of young people, and that's what this report reminds us of. It is still a lot cooler than the big social network is.
So how much of a concern do you think this actually is for Facebook, given that they own Instagram? Is it still a big problem if they're losing teen users?
Well, when I talk to teens who use Facebook, and a lot of them do, they use it for things that are more like responsibilities or utilities. They use it to coordinate their soccer matches, work on group projects with people from their Spanish class. I mean, it's the kind of thing that you kind of have to be on to survive in high school and college in a social setting with your teachers and all. And so it is more of a tool. It's not
like a utility.
It's not fun. And the way that teens are communicating, they're communicating in images, they're communicating in video. It's less the kind of status updates that we've seen on Facebook, which have become maybe increasingly political or increasingly heavy. This more light communication that we see on Instagram and Snap. So does it harm Facebook? I think Facebook made a really smart bet a few years ago in acquiring Instagram, and that's certainly become so crucial to their future. And so I'd love to see a little bit more color from the company in the future of exactly how much Instagram contributes.
Now, when it comes to Snap, you've got NBC doing a show now on Snapchat. CNN is now doing a daily show on Snapchat. How much traction are these kinds of things actually getting?
They're getting a lot of traction, like millions of viewers. It's very interesting. I mean, this kind of media consumption experience differs from Facebook in several ways. But first of all, it's mobile first. Second of all, it's in these short bites that people can really consume on the go. And it's something that caters to this very millennial audience that is increasingly not paying for cable, not watching conventional TV. So it's a way for brands like CNN and NBC to actually reach this new generation that may not be on Facebook.
So how well do we think the Facebook copying of Snapchat is actually working? I mean, obviously Instagram has copied some Snapchat features as well, but when it comes to Facebook and making the camera primary and adding stories, is it backfiring?
I wouldn't say yet that it's backfiring. I think with any user base of more than 2 billion people, some people are going to use whatever they create, But I haven't seen people use Facebook stories, at least on my own Facebook. And that's anecdotal. They haven't released any information on it, but I don't have you.
No.
Yeah, it sits
but
there
at
the top of my mobile app. Maybe we're old, Emily. But it's something that I haven't really seen gain traction. And it was the top thing that Mark Zuckerberg talked about at the F8 developer conference earlier this year. So that part is a little bit embarrassing. The fact that they made such a big deal about how this was the augmented reality platform of the future, and then we haven't seen a lot happen there. But in terms of Instagram, that is going so well. That is an incredibly successful copycat effort.
That was Bloomberg Technology's Sarah Fryer. Well, competition in the streaming space is set to get even more intense. Apple's $1 billion spending on original content in 2018 will allow it to produce about 10 shows. While it may seem like Apple is using deep pockets to launch original shows, it's entering a crowded field, already dominated by Netflix and Amazon. Michael Wolff, CEO of Activate, former president of MTV Networks, joined us to weigh in on this new media landscape.
Apple brings a lot to this party. And they've already got devices, they've already got people watching video on their phones and on Apple TV and on their computers. But at the same time, and they've also got a lot of data. They know what people are watching and they know what people are doing. But at the same time, it's very difficult to produce hit TV shows. YouTube is using data to be able to decide what shows that they're going to produce. So, for example, they're doing a spin-off of The Karate Kid because they know people are watching old clips of The Karate Kid, or they're doing shows about dancing because they know what people are looking at. In Apple's case, it's not as easy as going to the video store or the content store and saying, just serve me up some hit series. It's very difficult. It's very difficult to know what to produce. There's an old line that in Hollywood that nobody knows nothing, which means that no matter how many times you've made a film, you may not know what makes the next film or the next TV show successful. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how Apple evolves, and at the same time, they're competing against a bunch of other people. They're competing against Facebook, and they're competing against now YouTube, and as well as other companies that are out there that are already well established in the TV business.
Right. Facebook soon to unveil a watch tab for original series. YouTube also spending big on original series. Of the two, is it a toss-up in terms of who is better positioned to compete, or are you optimistic about them both?
It's hard to make the judgment based on their platforms. It really comes down to who's able to produce hit shows. And a lot of that revolves around talent, directors, writers, stars, people that they can put together. And then, of course, there's that bit of luck about what an audience will be interested in. Both of these platforms, one of the advantages that they have, and especially Facebook, is that they've got really hundreds of millions of people in this country who are on a constant basis going to that platform. And so, if nothing more, they're going to click on that watch button to see what's there. But when you look at an average of $3 million an episode, and you're talking about 10 episodes per season, it's gonna take a long time to burn through that $1 billion. And at the same time, it's going to take a while to ramp up. Once again, it's hard. You can't just go out and buy it. You've got to build it.
That was Michael Wolf with Activate. Coming up, the once-in-a-lifetime, out-of-this-world event that unfolded right before our very eyes. We will explain how tech played a role in the first total eclipse to cross the U.S. in 99 years. And if you like Bloomberg News, check us out on the radio. You can now listen on the Bloomberg Radio app, Bloomberg.com, and in the U.S. on SiriusXM. This is Bloomberg. Well, the total solar eclipse has come and gone this week, and it put the U.S. power grid to the test. Grid operators, utility owners, electricity generators braced for more than 12,000 megawatts of solar power, possibly going offline. Sunrun is the largest independent solar developer in the U.S. Its CEO, Lynn Jurich, spoke to Bloomberg during the height of the eclipse on the East Coast.
I think the best part about the sun is that it is so reliable. So when these eclipses happen, which happen, once a generation, as you mentioned, we have a lot of advance notice. So we were really able to work with the grid operators, and were able to, procure power to meet the needs during the eclipse. And I think it's important to put this into context too. When you look at our overall traditional power sources, they go offline all the time and without a lot of notice. And in fact, annually, they will go out to the tune of 9,000 times the amount of power loss that we'll see from this eclipse. So the sun really is there, it's reliable, and we're certainly asking our customers to turn their power down and enjoy it.
So is this, in a way, testing how you react in an event where we have solar power as a dominant force in the provision of power generation in the country? So you can look at what the options are in terms of just switching between one and the other, because as you said, in terms of solar power, that's what the most reliable source of energy actually that we have out there.
It is, and the cost reductions have been so significant that it really is becoming the dominant source of new generation. And the segment that my company operates in, which is on the rooftop, also adds a different dimension. And we often think about renewables as all sort of one and the same, but there's a difference between the large utility scale type renewables and what we do at the home level, which is really pushing out using the rooftop to produce the power, using your electric vehicle to store the power, getting a battery on this grid. And what we're going to see is a system that will be much more reliable with the addition of this rooftop solar, the storage, and the electric vehicles. And I really look forward to that.
But Lynn, to Julia's point here, we have been talking to power grid operators and utilities and scientists that are sort of going to use this as an opportunity to test their systems, their software, et cetera. Is there anything you at Sunrun are doing during the eclipse? Are you testing battery capacity, for example? What exactly are you all going to be observing?
Well, for our customers, we have about 150,000 customers across the country, so a full gigawatt of power. And, we certainly can test to see exactly how our systems will produce during this eclipse, and we will do that, and we'll record the data. We'll also look at what the consumer patterns are. So were we successful when we ask our consumers to, bring their consumption down? Were we successful doing that? And those are important learnings. But again, because this eclipse is, an eclipse actually in any given point across the world happens once every 300 to 400 years, so it's fairly rare. And so what we're more focused on is how do we get the storage piece to be cost effective so that when there's a situation like this, we're able to, fill up the battery with the solar power and dispatch it to the grid when the grid needs it most.
That was Lynn Jurich, CEO of Sunrun, speaking to Bloomberg Television. Meantime, we sat down with Bloomberg Tech executive editor Tom Giles to discuss the craze around this historic event. Take a listen.
Well, we used everything from very unsophisticated cereal box viewer, our colleague Brad Stone. I used some of those Google glasses that that I think you tested out earlier in the week. We saw people looking with their naked eye. I kind of wanted to shout over, I don't think you're supposed to do that. But, you know, here in San Francisco, it was a little cloudy. It was a little foggy. We're
about 70%.
Covered about 70% of the sun. That's right. A little anticlimactic here. But the thing about this eclipse, given the ubiquity of social media, when we got back into the office, you could hear, you could look on Facebook, you could look on Twitter, see the experiences of people across the country who were in the path of totality. I saw people posting photos just saying like, hey, my son just took this. It's like changed his life. You know, I was listening to people in South Carolina cheer as the sun went completely dark. So really, for some people, it had a very profound impact.
I actually did cover a solar eclipse in China in 2009 and was in the path of totality. So going to complete darkness, there's definitely this sort of magical, eerie feeling. The temperature completely cools, and you definitely heard people talking about that across the country. It was, as you say, sort of this communal moment. Even the president watched. He got a lot of flack on Twitter for looking up briefly without the glasses. We're looking at him now. He just took them off. But when he came out onto the balcony, there he is. There he looks up.
Very briefly. Hopefully he didn't do too much damage to his eyes, although people were, you can hear in the video, people down below the balcony shouting, hey, don't look. I mean, this was one of those moments, and I've seen essays about this, where this was an opportunity for the nation to come together and focus on something different, hopefully wearing glasses, without kind of the moment being upset by Washington, D.C. And yet, here's what happens. The president found a way to steal the thunder from this event as well.
Yet again, everyone had a different live stream up. NASA had a live stream. Twitter and the Weather Channel did a partnership, of course. It was all over cable news, but it was interesting to see how various tech companies, from Google to Twitter to Airbnb, actually turned this into a business opportunity.
We're able to really benefit from it. We talked to Airbnb. There were thousands of people along that path who rented their homes, in some instances for the very first time.
Right.
So they had this huge many-fold, I don't know exactly, can't remember exactly the number, surge in listings because people were wanting to be there. And if you look at Google Maps, you saw traffic patterns acutely, you know, very red in that path of totality.
And in fact, there were some folks in Idaho who I believe spent a lot of money and it rained, and yet they were still happy about the experience. So it was an all-around experience, I guess, to commune and watch this. As you're hearing there, looking at people in the path of totality.
People throwing parties. I was on a plane recently and a guy got sidelined going through security because he had a pair of welder's goggles.
Bloomberg Tech's Tom Giles there. And that does it for this edition of the Best of Bloomberg Technology. We will bring you all the latest in tech throughout the week. Tune in every day, 5 p.m. in New York, 2 p.m. in San Francisco. And remember, all episodes of Bloomberg Tech are live streaming on Twitter. Check us out at Bloomberg Tech TV weekdays. That is all for now. This is Bloomberg.